The effort that was put into Red Dead Redemption 2 continues to impress me after many years. After playing through its long story, extensive epilogue, and dozens of side missions, we're still not done. Throughout its vast open world are hundreds of random encounters full of curious, quirky, and sometimes downright nasty people to meet. And in many of them, some interesting history to discuss. So let's take a look at the real history of Red Dead Redemption 2. In a brief but common encounter, Arthur is challenged to a gun duel. This isn't the first time we've seen a duel in the game, and it certainly isn't the first time the United States had seen one. The first recorded American duel was between two men named Edward in what is now Massachusetts, back in 1621, about a year after the arrival of the Mayflower. They fought with swords. Pistols became the more popular weapon of choice for duels about 130 years later. In the years that followed, there were of course several duels, including quite a few between particularly notable people. In 1777, founding father Button Gwinnett was killed in a duel by political rival Lachlan Mackintosh. In 1804, in perhaps the most well-known duel, former Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton was killed by sitting Vice President Aaron Burr. In 1806, attorney Charles Dickinson was killed in a duel by lawyer Andrew Jackson, who later became the only US president known to have killed a man in a duel. In 1842, State Auditor James Shield and State Legislator Abraham Lincoln agreed to a duel with broadswords, but it was cancelled shortly before it occurred. Lincoln, of course, famously became president less than 20 years later. And in 1859, in what was later called the last notable American duel, David C. Broderick became the only sitting US senator to be killed in a duel after he was shot by his former friend David S. Terry, who the day before the duel had resigned as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of California. By the time of the Civil War, such duels had mostly declined. Elsewhere in Valentine, Arthur spots a pair of men stalking through a window.
There's 3 sheets to the wind, I reckon.
This phrase refers to being drunk or inebriated. It was fairly common by at least 1817, referring to the sheet that controls the sails on a ship. The ship loses control if the line isn't secure, and is said to be out of control if all 3 sails are loose, hence the term. Inside the window is a couple smoking opium. Historically speaking, this is entirely unsurprising. Opium was used to treat the sick and wounded during wars, including the American Revolutionary War. Several well-known American figures took opium for pain, like founding father Benjamin Franklin to deal with a bladder stone, and the aforementioned Alexander Hamilton following his duel, but before his death. Its usage increased dramatically during the Civil War. Union forces alone received almost 10 million opium pills and almost 3 million ounces of tinctures and powders during the war. Addiction often followed. From the 1840s to 1890s, the number of addicts in the country increased more than 6-fold, to nearly 1 in 20 Americans. Around the era of the game, usage gradually began to decrease, as doctors, and consequently state laws, began regulating its distribution. Also in Valentine, but certainly not exclusive to it, the player can witness a public hanging. This is also not too uncommon in the Old West, though it certainly wasn't without controversy. One particular judge, Isaac Charles Parker, became known as the hanging judge of the Old West. Of the more than 13,000 cases he tried, 8,500 pleaded guilty or were convicted, 160 were sentenced to death, and 79 were executed. The final public execution in the United States was in Kentucky in 1936, when about 20,000 people gathered to watch Rainey Bethea hanged after confessing to rape and murder. Less than 2 years later, Kentucky outlawed public executions, the last state to do so. In the saloon in Valentine, the player can meet John, perhaps best known for his unique raccoon hat. John loves to complain to thin air about lots of different things, and brags about how many different animals and people he's killed.
Don't know how many Redskins are killed, but they deserved it. They weren't Christians, so I sent them to hell.
This isn't too surprising. There were several incidents of Christian settlers killing Native Americans in the name of the Bible, like Ralph Lane in 1586, whose battle cry was "Christ our victory," or William Bradford in 1637, who described a scene as a fearful sight but a sweet sacrifice to God. Or John Underhill, who of the same incident felt that women and children perishing with their parents was sometimes demanded by the scripture. Even Christopher Columbus's adventures to the New World are said to have been inspired by the Bible, rather than any kind of science or reason. Behind the saloon in Valentine, players witness, and have the ability to stop, a scene of domestic violence as a man attempts to drown what appears to be his wife or partner. Unfortunately, this is also not entirely out of place for the time or era. Some decades earlier, the Mississippi Supreme Court essentially established that men could beat their wives if they were provoked and responded reasonably. North Carolina saw a similar conclusion reached in 1852, stating that husbands could not be prosecuted if the injuries were not permanent, meaning black eyes, bruises, and cuts were acceptable. The growing first-wave feminism movement in the 19th century began to see some changes made in legislation as well as public opinion. Tennessee is credited as the first US state to explicitly outlaw wife-beating in 1850, and other states followed. However, while judges and police would sometimes punish or condemn male perpetrators by the early 20th century, arrests remained rare, and a Supreme Court case in 1910 declared that a wife was unable to sue her husband in civil court for assault. So a scenario like the one presented in the game is likely not entirely inaccurate. Back at the saloon, the player encounters a sex worker who claims to have killed a man in self-defense, though it's strongly suggested that she is a more prolific killer than she'd have you believe. There's a well-known example of this happening in real life, and much later. In 1989 and 1990, 90 years after the game, sex worker Eileen Warnos shot dead and robbed 7 male clients, claiming that she had done so in self-defense after they had raped her or attempted to. She was sentenced to death for 6 of the murders and executed by lethal injection in 2002. If the player decides to help hide the body, they do so by placing it in a nearby pig pen and letting the pigs dispose of it. This is alleged to have happened in real life too. Joseph Brigham, a hog farmer, was known for his prized pigs. It turns out the reason for their success was that they were being fed the farmhands he was employing. This was discovered in 1902, when his newest employee found 2 severed fingers near his bed and alerted the authorities, who found evidence of at least 12 or 13 bodies. Brigham received life imprisonment, but died shortly thereafter. A little south of Valentine, the player can meet a man and his 2 sons building a house, and in one encounter help to defend them against outlaws demanding protection money. Such protection rackets are not new. There's some evidence suggesting they existed as early as the 12th century. They certainly existed during the Old West as well. Often it was lawmen who used their power and position to earn some extra money racketeering. Jim Courtright, known as Long-Haired Jim, was a lawman in Fort Worth, Texas, who was said to have run a protection racket for several years. It's believed that it was him offering protection to one business that resulted in the confrontation that ultimately led to his death in 1887. Opposite Valentine's other saloon is a man named Mickey, who claims to be a war veteran. Based on his outfit, this would be believable. It bears a resemblance to the Union Army uniform of the Civil War era. Some of Mickey's comments aren't entirely unbelievable for a veteran too.
I fought in a war, mister. I did. Sent me strange seeing all them fellas die.
Mental health issues, including post-traumatic stress disorder, were certainly present after the Civil War, and as mentioned before, the use of opiates during medical operations led to drug addictions. Some evidence suggests that the vast majority of soldiers weren't traumatized by the war, but times were certainly different. Many soldiers were strongly religious and relied heavily on their personal perceptions of glory and honor. So discussing any pain, especially mental health, was quite uncommon, much less seeking any assistance for dealing with it. In one of the game's most interesting encounters, Arthur stumbles upon an initiation ceremony for the Ku Klux Klan. In real life by this time, the KKK, as a unified organization, was no longer around. The game somewhat implies this, as the leader of this group complains about their low numbers.
Our numbers are waning, thanks to the fools in Congress and their ludicrous ideas.
The Enforcement Acts in 1870 and 1871 prohibited violence to prevent black people from voting, which, alongside the subsequent labeling of KKK members as criminals and terrorists, led to its disbandment around this time. That being said, an attempt to regroup the organization in the late 1890s is unsurprising. Smaller local groups, including paramilitary groups, emerged around this time. Attempts by black and poor white people to create a movement to support themselves against the aristocracy of the Old South was promptly met with stronger efforts to suppress and manipulate black voters and voices. The United States also saw increased immigration in the mid to late 19th century, and several laws were enacted and groups created in opposition to it. And when the KKK reorganized in the 1910s, anti-immigration was on its agenda. Interestingly, the outfits worn by Klan members in the game are seemingly historically inaccurate. While members of the first era of the KKK had occasionally worn masks, hoods, or robes, having a wider variety of outfits was considered important at the time in order to keep the organization more secretive. It's said that some members wore outlandish outfits, fake beards, animal horns, wizard hats, while others wore pillowcases or flour sacks. Some even wore blackface. It was the second iteration of the Klan, which emerged in the 1910s, that established the consistent hood and robe that is well known today and depicted in the game. It seems to have originated in the 1905 novel The Klansman by Thomas Dixon Jr. Its 1915 film adaptation, D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation, popularized both the image and the organization, and it regrouped only months after the film's release. The outfit began to be sold more widely in the early 1920s. The burning of the cross, as depicted in the game, is similarly not said to have been a symbol of the original iteration of the Klan, having also been introduced in Dixon's 1905 novel and popularized in Griffith's 1915 film. Dixon is thought to have drawn inspiration from the Scottish tradition of the Cran Tara, a cross that burned as a way of bringing Scottish clans to arms. In November 1915, 10 months after The Birth of a Nation debuted, a cross burning took place atop Stone Mountain, Georgia, officially reviving the KKK. As Arthur approaches the group, one of them refers to their leader as the Supreme One.
Shh, the Supreme One is talking.
Using words like Supreme wasn't uncommon for the KKK and related groups in the South around this time. In the 1920s, the imperial officers of the KKK used Supreme before their titles, like Supreme Chief Executive, Supreme First Vice President, Supreme Secretary. There's precedent for this word too. In the 19th century, the Supreme Cyclopean Council was a white extremist group operating in Tennessee. The meeting notes found on one of the members mentions that female members were still not allowed in the group. Unsurprisingly, this appears to be accurate. Women were excluded from the first era of the Klan. However, they did sometimes help in other ways, like with sewing costumes. One of the Klan's stated purposes was to protect women, though only white women of course, and seemingly only middle or upper class white women who strictly adhered to their cause. They were said to have abused and raped women who had lived with black men, or who had a bad reputation. Some decades after the game, in 1923, an auxiliary group called Women of the Ku Klux Klan was formed, becoming independent from the KKK. According to the group, members numbered around 125,000 and doubled to 250,000 within 4 months, with 36 states having chapters by November 1923. A letter found on another member of the group claims to be seeking a white utopia. Interestingly, this was actually a phrase that was once applied to the US state of Oregon, whose founding constitution did not permit black people to live there until 1926. Those who were already living there when it was admitted to the Union in 1859 were sometimes allowed to stay, though their numbers were limited. From gun duels to drugs, Christian killings to Klansmen, Red Dead Redemption 2's random encounters have a wild variety of characters to meet with interesting historical connections. But we've barely scratched the surface. There are still plenty of other weird characters to encounter, and of course with more characters comes more history for us to discuss.